Hold on, I'm gonna turn off my fan real quick because it's gonna be blowing in
Now
my fucking.
recording.
Shut the fuck up, James. Thank you. Oh wait, I'm not allowed to curse. Crap. 1 second.
Well, I'll keep you amused in this time. So, we're going to be having a special guest join in after 30 minutes. The House Speaker, Mr. James Berry. But in the meantime, we're going to be having a conversation over federal states' rights, and we'll move from there.
Okay. I'm back now.
Okay, hello.
Yes.
I introduced the topic. We're going to be talking about states versus federal rights and what the federal government's roles should be, maybe some limits on the federal government and stuff like that.
Yeah. I've got a few. I've got a few opinions. So obviously, one of the largest conflicts the United States has ever taken part in was its own civil war, where the South tried to secede, and due to the North being generally anti-slavery and wanting to limit the amount of slaves to just the southern states, Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, etc., etc. And they did not like that, which is kind of strange, because Abraham Lincoln, one of his campaign promises when he was running, was that he would be perfectly fine with allowing slavery to continue, but was clearly against implementing slavery in every new state that would be added into the Union. But the South didn't like that and decided to try and secede. But obviously citing states' rights and all that to own slaves.
I've heard like this interesting theory where they say that every Congress after the separation has been illegitimate because there hasn't been enough in the forum or something like that, and it's basically saying since the southern states seceded, the United States kind of had to violate its own constitution in a sense to do stuff because you didn't have all of the people there. And the northern mentality was, they're rebellious and they're still part of the United States. They're just in rebellion. Whereas the southern idea was more of, look, we're not part of the United States. Therefore, you should be able to function normally. And so I've heard this argument before. I've heard this argument. You didn't necessarily present it. So what do you think of that?
What do I think of what? Sorry, I with the argument that every Congress after the Civil War has been illegitimate?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's ridiculous because we were fighting a secessionist state. We were fighting rebels. So every Congress since 1861 has been legitimate. People who use that are some kind of breed of stupid to say that, because that makes no sense. That's like
I was
saying,
watching a video on it. It was captivating. I didn't agree with it.
That's just like saying every parliament since the English Civil War has been illegitimate because I don't know, they lost or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But another thing that's interesting about the Civil War is that I think people think it was started on slavery. I think it was more started on the idea of states' rights. And I think the only reason why slavery was really brought into the Civil War was to keep Europe away, because Europe wanted to help the South out because the South was supplying cotton and these raw goods which Europe desperately needed. And the North said, look, this is with slavery. We're going to emancipate the slaves, which I do think Abraham Lincoln genuinely wanted to do. And so kind of the North used it to keep Europe at bay. And I think that was actually very smart, that what Europe did there.
Well, Europe certainly wasn't going to be helping the South anytime during the entire Civil War, because the North had been well quickly industrialized and pretty well off for some time then, and the Europeans, seeing that clearly the North wasn't going to lose because we had more men, we had more weapons, we had basically 10 times whatever the South had. Um, they saw that and were clearly convinced immediately that the South wasn't going to win. They had no chance. So they didn't want to sour relations with the North, and because the rightful government would win out no matter what. So
I mean, if you kind of look at what happened, I think the biggest problem that the North had in the war is not that they did not have the equipment, not that they did not have the men. It's just they did not really have good leadership. Now, I think really what was their saving grace was Ulysses S. Grant, but I think the South had much better military leadership, and I think that might have had an impact on what Europe would have done. But I think Europe definitely was paying very close attention to the conflict because they did rely a lot on the United States, and especially when you see like the shift where a lot of stuff became let's say around the turn of the century, 40 years, 50 years after the Civil War, where a lot more of the goods that Europe had was coming from the United States because we had better wheat and stuff like that. And so I do think that Europe was eyeing this conflict and was definitely paying attention to it. And I think would have intervened if it took too long or if something like that happened.
well, yes, plenty of European nations, I believe, notable uh, states such as Prussia, I think Austria, France, and Britain sent uh, military attaches over to examine the conflict to prepare for any future wars that may take place, which was one of the reasons why, say, the Prussians in 1871 managed to invade and successfully capture large tracts of land from the French and then united the German Empire. But
Mhm.
moving back on to the topic of the United States, obviously, certainly people like to use the idea that the South, if it had one, would have eventually abandoned slavery, but that still doesn't justify with the South and its existence, because it existed to preserve slavery and it
Yes,
existed for the states' rights to own slaves, for the people in those states to own slaves, and for the people that owned slaves to use them as they saw fit because they were deemed property. And
yes,
that's wrong. You don't get to own a person just because
yeah.
they are a darker skin color than you and just because they were brought over from a different country.
I think that slavery was a very slippery slope that descended downwards, and I think it didn't necessarily start only with black people. I think that in the beginning they did use indentured servitude. Now I know that for sure, and they used very peculiar methods. They would get people drunk and tell them sign here, and then they would have to pay off an X amount of money in the call. They would have to pay off an X amount of time in the colony. So they did export people, but I think the idea specifically of slavery and specifically speaking with the U.S. I think the South was incredibly and very fearful that if they lose their slaves, their economy would collapse and
Oh
that they would
yeah,
not be able to recover. And that's why I think they would have clung to slavery until around the 1900s. Then I think where, let's just say that the U.S. was still split, the South and the North, uh,
yes,
that that the that the South would have kept on to slavery until around the 1900s, and then when stuff began to industrialize and stuff, I think by around the 1950s it would be very obsolete. There's no need for it,
yeah.
but I do think that there would still be segregation in the South
Oh,
to this day
definitely,
if they had not come back to us.
definitely. They people would most certainly have been raised to just deem African Americans as inferior, which is utterly ridiculous. There's no like people. I think nowadays tend to cling on to more racist individuals, at least cling on to really like pseudoscience's ideas of racial supremacy and racial hierarchy and all that other stuff, which is just utterly ridiculous and has no place in a modern civilization, modern society, because it just makes no sense because you forego science as we know it and then just adopt this whole idea that white man good, black man bad, which makes no sense. It's
It
childish.
really. And I think also what's interesting is moving on to more modern times is China is really eyeing Africa. And I think China has been very, very smart with this of going to countries and basically indebting a country to
Oh
do
yeah,
China's bidding.
yeah,
And I think that not a lot of people know about this, and the US hasn't done anything. Absolutely no action has been taken by the US to kind of go after China for doing this, or, in the most greedy and primitive sense, do it themselves.
exactly.
And I think that definitely we're going to see the consequences of that in the future when Africa begins to become more technologically advanced and become more of a world presence. That they'll basically become an arm of the Chinese Communist Party if the U.S. doesn't intervene, if it's not too late already.
Yes, I've heard about that. I think it was in Nigeria they were having to construct some kind of large I think it was a dam or just some large roadway like highway or what have you. And the Chinese they first reached out to the United States because naturally we're closer. We're the likeliest nation to go to if you need help when you're just a few hundred miles across the Atlantic and a pretty I'd say a pretty good ally. And then they went to the United States. The United States said no. So then they went to the Chinese, the second likeliest state to give you aid, or apparently the first now. And then the Chinese said, "Of course." And then they gave them their few hundred million. I don't know the currency of Nigeria. I guess Nigerian dollars or pounds, whatever currency they use, and help them build their roadway or dam or whatever it was. And then the Nigerians are now best friends with the Chinese, and a lot of other African countries have had similar projects trying to fix their industry or economies or just provide work for their citizens.
And
Instead,
I think the
a lot of room.
U.S.
Yeah,
does play a role in the fact that China, and not in the fact that China, but in the fact that Africa is struggling. And here's why: because we have this culture, and it started in the 1960s, of giving a lot of free things to Africa, and that has completely crushed their industry. If you look at the clothing industry, you can watch a documentary and you see people, I love you. I love New York shirts. Where do you think that came from? That
yeah,
came from America, and it's coming from Western countries. And all of this aid, all of this help is actually hurting Africa and hindering them from moving on by destroying local businesses through all
yeah,
these charitable acts. Now, I'm not saying that charity is bad, but I'm saying that if you want Africa to progress and you want Africa to become more powerful, what you need to do, and especially with the US, is stop giving them free things. Now, with China, and I think what China's doing is very smart, is China's pretending to come bringing help to Nigeria and stuff. But the only thing they really want to do is control them and to have access to their resources and exploit that in the future.
but the you also have American companies like Nestle, um, I think Nike, I don't know the total extent of all the companies that have their hand in Africa, but certainly quite a majority. I think Starbucks as well. They have these locate these installations in Africa up and all over the continent for their own products to to make them or ship over the necessary materials from Africa and then have them made in the United States or have them made in China or whatever. Because and that's a whole other problem with American
Right.
companies completely foregoing American labor and relying on Chinese labor to make their products and then and they're going to be a lot cheaper, a lot easier for the companies, sure, but then you're having thousands and thousands of Americans that could have work just unemployed because of these companies that have no interest in the common good for the United States or their fellow Americans. and rely on cheap foreign labor, which is absolutely
Absolutely.
ridiculous.
And the thing is that people are complicit in this, in the fact that not only that we buy Chinese products and we buy them in bulk, but I think that people put so much blame on these companies, and it's our own fault as well, because at the end of the day, we don't choose to buy American. We choose to buy Chinese. Why? Because it's cheaper. And I think that everyone's very well aware in this country that we and our companies exploit the Chinese workers and exploit Chinese labor to produce our products. And I think this needs to come an effort not only from the government, which I think will be very ineffective in this, but needs to be from the people, where the people will say, enough is enough. We're going to buy American. We're going to hire American, because every time that we buy a good made in China, we make China stronger and we make them more powerful. And I think if you really want to deal with China, stop buying Chinese and the problem will disappear.
Yes, certainly. I think when it comes to Chinese goods, and a good way to influence companies to stop um, exporting and importing goods to China would be to implement higher tariffs. Certainly,
Oh, yes.
that way they'd have a much easier time making goods in the United States and selling them to Americans and employing Americans rather than foreign laborers in China, because then they'd have a much harder time bringing them in from China to the United States.
Yes, I think that that's a very good idea. I was thinking, what about a travel tax, where you would tax people in China? No. Okay, I'm saying random nonsense. So, what if we have a tax where for every mile that you travel when you're importing goods or something like that, to some extent, you would have to pay a certain amount of money for the amount of goods being traveled to the United States. Now, it would be expensive, don't get me wrong, but it would make domestic travel in the country seem much cheaper. So, instead of bringing a lot of items in bulk from China to the US, doing domestically would just be a much nicer option, even though it will be more expensive for workers and stuff. The travel, which can actually hurt companies a lot, would mitigate that and would make America seem more I don't know how to say it, more appealing.
Certainly to American companies, yes. But I think we want to be as unappealing as possible to foreign companies, unless they're from our much more
Yes.
much more long-time allies, such as Britain, France, Germany. We have plenty of opportunities with, say, the Mercedes company, the BMW company, um, which come from Germany, obviously, uh, and and they have plenty of dealerships and factories all throughout the United States, hiring American labor, which is very good. And that's what we need. We need to influence these companies as much as possible to ensure that they work with us rather than against us with the Chinese uh, and the Russians. But
Yes. Yeah.
moving on from that, since I think we've established that topic pretty well, what was our other? What was our Who was our special guest we were going to have on today?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Mr. James Berry, the Speaker of the House.
All right, Mr. James Barry, would you like to make your? There you go.
Hello. Yes. When it comes to, I'm going to be going back onto where you said the whole economics plan with China and the possible tariffs and everything.
Yes.
Like I stated last night in the Shapiro show, if you tuned into it, I stated that in the simulation that it would be technically impossible for us to take on Russia, China, and its allies military-wise. So I came up with the plan to put more tariffs on them with Congress if they supported that, and then start producing more American goods so that the American people and the American economy can go back to like what it was in the 1950s, where we were the world's economical powerhouse. Because if you look at the 1950s, the closest second that we had as an economic powerhouse was the Soviet Union, and yet their economy was horrible because you know why? They were so focused on the military advancements that quote unquote benefited the Soviet Union. We were an economical powerhouse by a long shot, and if we tried again, we could totally become the world's super powerhouse. And it's not that hard. All you have to do is support your local businesses, and soon enough, those local businesses will be known nationwide. And guess what happens? They begin making so much profit that they can start making revenue worldwide, nationwide, and it's not that hard because literally, like I just said, all you have to do is start supporting your local businesses. While yes, there are going to be major businesses like Ford, Chevy, Dodge, based in like Mexico and China, where they still make products for the American goods, but their quality will be going down because the local businesses' quality will be going up because they're being American made, while everything else that we use is going to be Chinese made. And guess what is so important? The quality behind those goods. If you look at
not necessarily. I mean, if you want to look at the Industrial Revolution and look at all of these trades, all of these high quality goods that like fizzled out, it became like luxury items where only the rich could really afford these high-end handmade goods, and these cheaper goods tended to flood the market and like make profit margins so small for these higher quality goods that a lot of them went out of business. So I don't think necessarily that quality is how people go. I think it's more quantity. And I think you can see that especially in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution, how a lot of these man-made goods were replaced by these more processed goods. And you can also see that how the by around the 1960s, how these bigger, more retail, more processed companies completely squeezed out the last drop of other companies and other businesses.
Yeah, it was certainly. If there's one thing the Industrial Revolution completed, it was certainly making it easier for us to produce goods. And then we had interchangeable parts that could be easily replaced. So, and that also made it easier for the production of weapons, such as muskets, um, back when those first came about. And nowadays, today, we can more easily take apart our weaponry or our toys or our cars or what have you, and then fix them, and then you're good to go really quickly. That's certainly been a benefit of the Industrial Revolution and of progress in general, because it's wonderful things like that the human race has managed to accomplish. We went from I forgot what the quote was exactly, or what the proper statistic was, but it was something along the lines of we went from using bronze to, what was it, iron, in over 1,000 years, but it took us a shorter amount of time to go from swords to guns and atomic bombs than it did from sticks and stones to swords. But yeah, it's just great things like that. Well, I mean, not necessarily great in certain cases, but it's certainly you can see how far we've progressed.
Oh, absolutely. I think that the Industrial Revolution has really modernized our society and has really made a lot of things easy. But I do think that buying American is a very good thing. It's just that you can't compete with Chinese if they are able to produce products and bring them to the US at a cheaper rate than what we are able to produce here. And I think another issue that we're going to have is, let's say we begin having these lower labor jobs flooding the market again in the 1950s. The issue that we will have is illegal immigrants will come to this country in higher numbers. And why? Because if you look at the meat factories, and the meat factories are one of the very few industries where you still need manual labor to cut the meat and stuff. They are being flooded by illegal immigrants entering our country and finding jobs. So the thing is, not only that you're going to want to bring jobs back to America, but you're also going to want to find people who are actually willing to work in these jobs, which if you look in these meat facilities are not. Also, with people being able to go to higher education also adds to the issue of buying American. Though it would be beneficial to the United States, achieving it would be very hard. So what do you think would work with that, Mr. Berry?
I think the way we can go around the problem, the way that we can solve this problem that of not being able to compete with the Chinese is that we got to look at their laws for their corporations versus ours. We are so strict when it comes to child labor, overworking, and everything. If somebody volunteers to work, they should be allowed to work no matter what. We shouldn't have to put certain laws into place so they can quote unquote be safe in their workforce. If they want to go into a job that's risky, that is their choice. So say if they want to go into the construction companies, because there's a lot of those going on with immigration. A lot of immigrants that come to America, they go into construction because it's the easiest trade and easiest thing to learn. And that's where a majority of workers get their revenue, and majority of all the companies get their revenue from. Why do you think that construction companies are one of the biggest foundations for America besides coal and logging? Because they know that the risk is there, and yet they work anyways, and they get paid for it. They shouldn't have to have the government intervene with that, because it'll fluctuate by itself naturally. And then once it does its own thing, more people go to that job, the more revenue it makes. And guess what? Other companies compete with that. And when it's competed with its own states, when its own nation, people won't go to foreign countries so that they can make more money there than they will here.
I mean, I think that the issue is much more complex, that we don't have the labor. I think that that's a huge part of it. But I also think another thing, and I think Otto can agree, is that let's say you work in America and you have an 8-hour shift a day, and let's say you get paid minimum wage in America, and that I think is around $15. I think that's what the minimum wage is. Well, let's just say you're in New York, so the minimum wage is $15. You're going to work around $200 to $300 for 8 hours. You go to China, and I think it's much cheaper there to work 8 hours. What is it there if you work 8 hours in China? What's the average wage? I'm not sure.
I'm not entirely sure.
But I know it's definitely much cheaper than what it is here. And I know that they work for longer hours. That's something I'm definitely sure of. So I think not only is it cheaper to manufacture, it's cheaper and people work for longer hours there with the deregulation.
Another thing is, the reason why it's harder to work here and it's more expensive to work here is because we have a federal and state limited minimum wage. The minimum wage shouldn't even be up to the states or the federal government. It should be up to the companies itself. Because if a company is trying to make wages, they need to give workers the least amount of minimum wage possible so that the companies keep the money and that they're able to make more revenue so they can do whatever they want with it. And then the workers get the wages that the company doesn't need. And then it's easier to work here. So it's not really a the government shouldn't be really that involved with the companies. Yes, there should be regulations like no child under the age of like 12 should be able to work. But if a certain age is required, then it should be lowered to at least 12. Because I know many 12-year-olds that want to make money because they have nothing better to do with their life. But they should not be able to, like, they should be able to work, but they should not be able to be in dangerous environments while they work. Like,
And
it's not.
I've got some information from one of our listeners. They said that the average wage in China is around $3.75 US dollars. So compare that to 15. You're not going to beat that. There's nothing you can do really labor wise. Now, Mr. Secretary of State, what do you think? What do you think some ways are that we could? Secretary of Defense, excuse me. What do you think are some ways that the U.S. could combat the China issue by making the U.S. more appealing?
Well, see, that's the thing. If we implement tariffs on Chinese goods, both being and American goods, both being exported to China and Chinese goods being exported to America, and like I said, that'd be a good way to combat corporations from relying on Chinese goods and Chinese production, because then they would have way more incentive to produce locally in the United States. Because if they're being taxed far more exported to China and far more importing from China, then they're going to see, hey, we're going to be making a lot more if we stick with the United States. So let's start refocusing our labor force back in the States and see how that gets us. And that's just a general insight. Not that I have um, amazing economic experience. I'm not an economist or really all too great with running economies or whatever, but that's just a general, like, it just seems like a good an easy observation to make.
Yeah.
And you also have, like you said, they have cheaper wages, they have cheaper labor there. That's the whole point. Tariffs, more money, not going to China. So then, companies will be like, okay, we can make a lot more just completely overgoing China. So that's my take on the situation. What would be best to solve the problem?
Now, another thing I would like to bring attention to is the Speaker of the House has been really making this push to give statehood to a bunch of different places which are U.S. territories. Now, what do you think on this issue?
Well, the population of Puerto Rico is certainly high enough to give it citizenship, but the Virgin Islands and Guam, I don't think they come anywhere near the required population, because the required population for statehood is at least 600,000 citizens, I believe. And
Yeah.
the islands that make up the Virgin Islands and the territory of Guam certainly do not have that many people. So it's the statehood for Guam and Puerto Rico, or sorry, the statehood for Guam and the Virgin Islands is certainly um oh wait, I'm sorry. I think I may have overstepped the statehood requirement. I think it's 400,000. Is it 400,000? Sorry. It's been a while since I've what is the statehood requirements? Let me look into this real quick.
When it was enacted in the land ordinance of 1784, it was 20,000 inhabitants. And after looking through it, it hasn't been changed that much.
I could have sworn it was 400,000. That's strange.
Last time I did check, though, it was 40,000.
Oh, that's probably where I got it from. That's my
So
bad.
Using the 40,000, Guam has a population of roughly 385,000.
It still doesn't meet the threshold,
That's
though.
way larger than I thought. Okay, yeah, okay. That's
So and
just
plus,
my confusion and lack of investigation. That's my bad.
Yeah, that's fine.
no, it's all good. But the reason why I've been pushing for these is because whenever we look at Puerto Rico as an example, we have been federally taxing them since they became a territory of the United States.
Yes.
Now, if you'll go with me here. Oh well. American Samoa? Okay. My bad. I was sidetracked by something. Anyways, moving on. When we look at Puerto Rico, we've been federally taxing them since they became a territory. Now, I don't know about you, Mr. Secretary of Defense or Justice Henry Bell, but isn't the whole reason why we revolted against the British is because we were being taxed without being able to be represented in their parliament?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment to make of one of the reasons why that we did have that. Yeah.
And plus, if we continue to hold them as a territory, that'll begin to make people continue to think that America has many territories around the world, and which can be argued that we do, and people are going to continue to think that it's due to American imperialism, which I argued a lot that never truly existed in American history.
American imperialism? Well, American colonialism, yes, and we certainly were imperialistic for a long time in terms of conquering large tracts of territory and taking it from the Indians and
Yes,
native
but
peoples, and then moving and trying to take Canada and then Alaska and then Panama.
well,
And
the thing is, we out of all of those, the only war we truly started because of it was the War of 1812 when we tried to take Canada.
And the Spanish-American War, and the Mexican-American
And
War.
the Spanish.
Yeah, and the Mexican-American War. But every other territory that we have quote-unquote colonized is what we have bought from the Spanish, the French, the Russians. So
Yes.
it may be wrong that we went in there and set up our government in it, but it was our duty and our right to do so because it was manifesting our destiny to colonize what we have bought.
Well, we didn't. Well, I don't mean to constantly correct you, sir, but we did not buy the Philippines. We did not buy
Oh.
American Samoa. We did not buy Panama. We
I know.
invaded Panama, and
I know.
the only land we bought, sir, was Alaska that I know
Yes.
of. That is
We
the
bought
only land we
Alaska from
bought.
the Russians, I
What is
think.
not? It would not be proper to refer to all our colonial possessions currently and in the past as being all bought, because they were not all bought. Only, I believe, one was bought, and that was Alaska.
Well,
But yeah.
Yes, let me correct that.
Another topic that I would like to draw our attention to in our time with the speaker is DC statehood. And I think that eyes have been perched since you have been putting this push to have these colonies be and enter the Union. What is your view on DC statehood? Do you think that DC should become a state and should become a part of the United States?
No, I do not believe that DC itself should not become a state because it is federal land that is used for the federal government. And guess
Yes.
what? And guess what will be used if it does become a state? Its immense amount of electoral votes, even if
Yes.
it's low.
I don't know the population of DC, but I don't think it meets the threshold for statehood population wise. But I could be wrong on this.
What I have been taught is that DC has been taken from 4 different states.
Yes, it has.
And
That's true.
And the reason why it was done for is because that's where we decided the federal capital should be. So we cannot just say, oh, hey, we have the borders set up for DC. When in actuality, the borders for it are just the normal states that it happens to lay on. It intercedes 4 states. So why should we create new borders around those 4 states and then just say, here, DC is a state? I simply don't agree with that.
What do you about the prospect of DC statehood, Mr. Cartwright?
What was that?
What do you think about the prospect of DC statehood? I don't like it. I think it's a power grab made by the Democrats to
While
add something to the union to help them win elections. What do you think about it?
while yes, what I've been doing to Puerto Rico and Guam can be seen as a power grab, I simply have not done that. I don't believe in the power grab that people could believe that I'm doing. I don't support DC statehood because I truly believe that it would be a power grab for the United States.
Yeah.
But
Not for the United States, for the Democrats specifically.
true, but I simply don't believe that DC should become a state in these times.
Yeah, I don't.
Maybe if something happens and we need to restart or something, and we need a solid capital and a solid foundation of a state, then yes, maybe then we should consider statehood for DC. But as of right now, no, we should not consider statehood for DC.
Yeah, I think DC statehood is very partisan. I mean, you look at DC's population, it's 95% Democrat. So, and it's not like they don't get to vote in elections. I think it's more for the senatorial seats than it is for anything else, because any state that's added to the union gets a shiny new 2 Senate seats. And I think it's more for that than anything else. And I just think it's very partisan. That's why I don't support it. And also, like you said, there's a very good reason not to support it in the fact that DC is federal property for federal land, and people do live there. There's nothing surprising about that, but that's not the purpose of DC, is to be an area to live and to colonize. It's more of an area to be used as the central and the opus of our federal government and the power which it holds. So,
Yeah.
I want to move on more to guns. Now, I know that you're very supportive of guns, but do you think that there's a limit to the ability to bear arms? Do you think that, let's say, if you're a crazy person, do you think that a crazy person should have a gun?
No, I do not believe that they should be able to have a gun. And while, yes, many of the libertarians that I'm friends with will call me a snake for this, but I truly believe that if somebody's not mentally fit, or if they're mentally insane, they should not be able to own a gun.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, yes, we do have that Second Amendment, that right to bear arms. And I think that that is a very important and very integral part of America and our society. But I think that if you are mentally insane and do not understand the potential damage and the potential harm that holding or even having a gun could have to our communities, I think that you shouldn't have a gun.
Now,
What do you think of background checks then?
I support background checks to a certain extent because it can be argued that they're infringing upon your personal life, but it's not really that personal when you look at it, because you're going to the court system, pulling your background check from there. And you can argue that, hey, you're looking into my personal life, but it's your life from the government that they're looking at. They're looking to see if you committed any crimes, how mentally fit you are. So, but
I mean, it's stuff that they already know already. You know, it's not like it's new information that they're digging up about you. It's stuff that's in the public record. It's stuff that they know already.
Yeah. So if you're going to be going to buy a gun for the first time, you should only have one background check. If you go to buy multiple guns, multiple weaponry, or anything, they should use that singular background check unless you have committed a crime since then.
But see, to get that information, you would have to get another background check.
Yes.
I
So
think that background checks are not necessarily bad. I think where I would have to draw the line is limiting guns. Now, I've made the Gun Protection Act, so I guess I'm quite biased on this. But I think when the federal government or a state government says, look, you're not able to host this gun for X, Y, Z reason, I think it's very irresponsible. I think that, and especially with the loopholes, like there was one automatic weapon that you could get through a certain institution and you could get that legally. But getting it, you couldn't just go to a gun store and get it. You had to go to like a specific area to get it. And I think that that was very weird that you say, okay, you're not allowed to have this automated gun, but you're able to get it this other way. That might be a little bit more difficult. But I think that gun restriction in itself is authoritarian and in a sense totalitarian, because if you look at all of these regimes, what is the first thing that they do? The first thing they do is take the guns as quick as possible, and they do it for a reason, because you cannot contain a population which is armed. You can only contain an unarmed population.
And another thing on that, I would like to take a look with you at the effects of like an authoritarian local government. Actually, on June 4th, I believe, many years ago, there was this man. He was getting quote unquote treaded on by his local government and his state government, and here's what he did. All right, he took a bulldozer. We've all heard the story of the killdozer, no doubt. It's a legendary story. And I fully support what he did. He took a bulldozer, took like 6 months to turn it into a tank, and then he went down into his federal courthouse, like the local courthouse, and he began to tear it down. And yeah, and I fully support that action from him because the local government was screwing him over in the ass, and he really couldn't do anything about it civilly because they would rule against his favor because he already tried that. So he did what he thought was reasonable, and he decided to go against the local government. And it's the American foundation that whenever a government becomes unjust, it is our right and our duty to be obligated to destroy it.
Now, like, I want more details on this because that will help me come up with a more educated stance on this. But did he go like to state courts and Supreme Courts and you know go up there, the echelons of the court system?
Yes. Let me pull this up real quick. Let me see.
Interrupt, but I'm pretty sure we have our next interview a bit
yes,
late.
Yeah. I'm so sorry that we have to cut this short.
It's all good.
Yeah, next time we have this podcast, come up with more information on this topic, and we'll be happy to have you back.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
All right, our next guest is the Senate Minority Leader. Welcome, Mr. Henry. I don't know how. Can you pronounce your last name? Yeah.
Yes.
Welcome.
On my temporary time here, I would like to say that due to it being 11:16, it'd actually probably be better if you waited until the next podcast to have me on and just kept Mr. Barry for the remainder of this episode.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Barry, you're back. You're back on the air.
Yeah, I am. Thank you, Mr. Minority Leader. Now, like I was saying, well, I'm trying to find some background about it.
Mm-hmm.
And all I'm really finding is that he cost nearly $7 million in property damage. Let's see.
While you're finding evidence, Mr. Wright, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
What do you think about this situation? Been a little
Well,
quiet lately.
well, I heard about it some time back, and it was a very interesting topic, and it was a very interesting video I watched. But it was really saddening for me to hear that the man who did that took his own life while in the bulldozer he was operating.
Oh, that's very tragic. Do you think that that they could have taken any action against him, the government, or do you think his actions were kind of protected under the declaration? I think that would have been an interesting case if it was brought before the Supreme
I
Court.
mean,
But
what
what do you
he did was certainly illegal, but moral-wise, I think he was justified completely,
Yeah.
because he had, like Mr. Barry said, but I'll reiterate what he said in a more professional manner. He had been pushed over by his local government, certainly, and was quite reasonably so frustrated and had enough of constantly being swindled out of what he was owed. So he took up arms, so to say, I guess, in his own manner, and took care of uh, business.
Yep. Did that courthouse actually ever get repaired?
I believe so. Yes.
So I guess his vigilante justice didn't really work that long. But I think that that's a very interesting case to point out that people have taken up arms against the government and are morally justified, like Mr. Wright said, with the declaration saying we have the right to alter or abolish a government if it does not follow the will of the people. Now, one man's view is not necessarily the will of the people, but I could definitely see how that could be an interesting discussion to have. But I do want to remind our viewers that if your court case does get rejected or denied, that you do have the ability to appeal that court case to a higher court. So let's say you sue someone for defamation of character in a lower court and it doesn't go through, you do have the ability to ask a higher court to take that case if you want that to be overruled. Now, it doesn't necessarily work all the time, but you can do that.
So I was looking it up. The reason why he decided to do what he did was because the local government was planning to build, let me see here. Sorry, I had it earlier. So
Let's take your time.
okay, so in 2001, the local city approved of construction of a concrete plant, zoning the layer next to Hemeyer's for the use. And Hemeyer, the owner of the Killdozer, owned a small welding shop that he opened in 1992. And the negotiations he had with the cities were rough to begin with. And whenever he found out that the city was building a concrete plant right next to his welding shop he's been using for 9 years, he was furious, and so he petitioned to the city to have the property rezoned to prevent the construction of the power plant or whatever, but was rejected on multiple occasions. And I don't think that, so he probably went to the local courts to do that, and then it was obviously denied. And that's where, just like you said, that if it was failed by a local court, you can go to a higher court. And that's where I think he didn't really realize that he could do that. So I think that that's when he decided he had enough. And that's when, in 2003, he started building his Killdozer.
Well, again, I don't necessarily think this is really legally justified. I actually learning more about this case right now because the federal government, under the Constitution, does have eminent domain powers, and I think that can apply to local governments too. So I can understand, definitely you'd be furious if something like that was happening, and I can understand where he's coming from. But, there, like I said before, there is a court system. I think it was very masterfully made, even though there is a lot of corruption in the court system. Don't get me wrong. We've seen that constantly, but I do think that his actions were necessarily justified.
Another thing, I'm not sure, because the state law varies from state to state.
Yes.
But here in Kentucky, in real life, if the local government plans to build something on your property, you have the right to give the consent to let them build it, and they pay you to move off of your land. But at the same time, you have the right to say no, and then they have to do something like go find another
Eminent
place
domain.
to build it.
Or they
And
could
I think that,
invoke eminent domain.
yes,
They could invoke.
it can go one of those three ways. And I personally believe that if you say no to the government, to your state or local government, that they should not ensure eminent domain on you, because then that would be very, very wrong, because you're taking away something from one person in order for something better for a whole society. I don't agree with that at one bit.
Eminent domain, I think, was made more in times of crisis, where let's say we're in the middle of a war or something, and a bomb shelter or something needs to be built, and it needs to be built in this location because of, I don't know, certain amount of reasons or something, that they would invoke eminent domain. I don't think that you should go around using eminent domain. Let's say you want to build a school library or something. No, I don't believe in that, but I do believe that it does have a place and it does make sense in the proper context.
Yes, I 100% agree with you like that. So in my town, in Henderson, where I'm from, we are building a new bridge because one of our bridges that we're using right now to get from Kentucky to Indiana is about to give out. So we're building another bridge from a town over from us, so it's easier to go there. And the reason why I don't support eminent domain is because if we invoked eminent domain on everybody living in the town over from us, Spotsville, guess what happens to all of those people that live in their houses? They're homeless now.
Yes, yeah.
And I don't believe that a local government could pay for all of those people that are going homeless.
Oh, you'd be surprised how much money they have.
With a town of like roughly 40,000 people,
depending on they might be able to, but if they aren't, usually what happens is they'll pay like an exorbitant amount of money to get you out.
True. Yeah.
You to move, and usually, like, let's say a property is worth 200,000, they'll probably pay you like around 300,000, and if you keep on budging, they'll pay you a little bit more than that.
Eminent domain is kind of like, give me a moment.
Well, eminent domain, in my opinion, I think it does have a place in our society. Like I said before, there are situations where invoking eminent domain is something that needs to be done for the greater good. And I think that eminent domain is something that isn't really talked about that much. It's not really abused by the federal government in the modern day of politics, but it definitely is something that exists. And I think the founding fathers put it in the Constitution and gave the federal government that right. And I think they did that for a reason. And I don't necessarily think that it's in itself is hurtful, but I do think that the abuse of eminent domain for things that really would not help our community, I do think is hurtful.
So, like I was saying before I had to momentarily leave, eminent domain is kind of like the use of socialism. And it may be extremely stretched. It may be extremely stretched. But we have to look at the times where some form of socialism was beneficial to the United States. I would like to take a look at World War I and World War II whenever, in order for the war effort, we insured bonds and women in the workforce and everything while our men were out in the field. Now, that's when we should be using eminent domain in the time of war, just like some form of socialism, because in order to have a strong military force in the time of war, we have to have the means of production to match it. And
Yes.
so that's where socialism can lie. Whenever it comes to eminent domain during times of war, just like you said earlier, if a place needs to be insured, like a bomb shelter, and that needs to be erected in order for the safety of the people, then yes, that's where eminent domain needs to be invoked and put into action. Not in times of peace, where people are trying to live their lives freely.
We have around 2 minutes, so I'm gonna ask that we give closing statements on this. So, do you have anything else you would like to tell the American people? In 1 minute.
If I have anything to tell the American people, it's that whenever election time comes around for midterms, be sure to vote James Barry for HD1. That's all I have to say.
All right. This has been Liberty Bell with Justice Henry Bell, Secretary of Defense Otto Wright, and our guest speaker, James Barry. Otto, do you have anything you would like to say in closing?
It has been a pleasure. Apologies for not talking too much later in the show. But I was fascinated by what Mr. Barry had to say and the conversation you two had going. So it's been another good episode. And it's been a pleasure to be your co-host once again.
All right. This has been very wonderful. And I think we're going to wait for the bot to stop recording